I also sort of want to start by saying that this is not an academic or even really that objective a evaluation of the news media from a Christian perspective. It is a subjective, experience-based presentation on having gone through a number of roles working in the public square, what has been my experience of the news media, and what lessons have I taken away from it. And hopefully through sharing those and maybe some reflections, more hopeful reflections at the end, I know many of you won't be in news media directly, but I think there may be some principles that we can apply to communications as Christian communicators in the public square. So we'll have some sort of group work and some questions at the end. And my intention really is to go through my story for the majority of my speaking time through the jobs that I have worked. But to give you a little bit of an introduction, first of all, I should just say, by the way, this is, I think, my fourth or fifth talk this week. I am becoming known as the Lego Man. So some of you, that may be very popular. And I have to put a disclaimer, as I've said to other groups, I am not a Lego obsessive, but I am a Lego fan. So it's normally one significant Lego project every 6 to 12 months, something like that. So, I've just finished the Statue of Liberty. So, which was a Christmas present from a while ago that I was saving up, and my wife has been away for 6 weeks. So what does a husband do but build a Lego? There is a story that David Beckham, apparently, when he travels a lot and he's not always with his family, that one of his riders, one of his requests is that he has a Lego set or Lego sort of in his hotel room. I'm not sure if that's true, but it for simple men, it distracts us very, very well. I'm not defined by being a Lego fan. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm 49 years old. I've had 7 full-time paid jobs since leaving university. I was born and raised in Wales, which is one of the nations of the UK. Born and raised Scottish father, but Welsh mum, and I was raised as a Welsh speaker. So Welsh is my first language. So again, like some of you, I'm speaking in my second language today. I did all my exams in school and schooling in the Welsh language. It is a completely different language to English. It's not just English with a bit of an accent and some weird words. It is a far older language and very beautiful, but I won't go into that now. I'll become a Welsh nationalist by default if I speak about that for too long. Married to Melinda, who is American from Boston. She was working in a large church where we met in central London, a church called All Souls. Some of you are familiar with John Stott as an author. That's where John Stott spent his whole career as a preacher. We met in All Souls. We've been married. This October, it'll be 21 years. We don't have any children, which selfishly gives us lots of opportunities of freedom to do things that the responsibility of children wouldn't allow. That's all I'm really going to say for now. The last thing I'd say is I came from a sort of a old industrial town that was quite run down and poor in southwest Wales. The surrounding area is very rural, very beautiful countryside, lots of farming, but the town I grew up in was steel and coal that had closed down in the 1980s. Coming as a Welsh speaker from that background, going to university in London was a big deal. There was normally one person every 2 or 3 years that would be allowed to leave Wales because they'd got access or entry into Oxford University. I was rebellious. I was clearly the left-wing radical because I went to the London School of Economics, where I did 2 degrees, and where my story that I'm going to now pick up starts. Because after graduating, I was very fortunate to have a nice scholarship to do a master's degree. That meant I could postpone making a decision about my career for one more year. Finished, went traveling for a bit, came back, applied for lots of different jobs, completely random, very different, depending on what I thought was interesting. I could have ended up working in the city, but I ended up working in a research centre or a think tank based back at the London School of Economics. So my career and my story with you today starts as an idealistic 21, 22-year-old starting in academia, in research, believing that this was going to be a career of truth-seeking and truth-telling. Some amazing people that I got to work with at the beginning of my career. But the centre was a brand new centre. It was the mid to late 1990s. In the UK, Tony Blair had become Prime Minister. It was no longer fashionable to talk about poverty. We were talking about social exclusion. So this new centre got set up with lots of funding to examine what is social exclusion and what can we do about it. And the team that was the sort of the new team going into the centre, we went away for 2 or 3 days to think great thoughts about social exclusion and what were we going to examine and how we were going to work together. And one of the leading academics leading the centre, I remember very vividly, the first evening we were there together as a team, got up and we were all anticipating him beginning to explain what social exclusion was. And what he said was, the answer is 10%. 10% of the UK is socially excluded, and the next 2 years is about proving that's correct. Suddenly, the idealistic 21 and 22-year-old thought, maybe this isn't quite about the truth-telling and truth-seeking that I thought it was. I had the opportunity while there working with some politicians, lots of government officials, but also public sector workers in housing, social housing, in schools and education, and medicine, and sort of people sort of organising those services at different levels, from national down to local. And of course, part of academia, the reality of academia, is not just the sort of purity of being in your ivory tower and thinking great thoughts and doing research, but how do you communicate that? Increasingly, academia is about influencing the culture and or public policy. So there's a bit of our thinking about, well, how do we communicate the outputs that we're creating to politicians and to a wider audience? So that was sort of really the first time, not really that I came into contact with the news media, but certainly the broader media that was influencing public policy discussion in the late 1990s. And so there's some reflections about how I can sort of take from that time. The first is that even truth seekers have an agenda. So however admirable and noble you think the person is that you're working with and that you're covering or that you're reporting or that you're reflecting, they may be saying that they're all about truth, but there is an agenda behind that. Even if it's as neutral as I want to be quite popular and I want my work to be well known, or I've got a very clear objective of what I wanted this piece of work to achieve in terms of change, both short-term and local, but also long-term and wider. Also, one of the things I sort of learned very early on, that data and evidence may lead to knowledge, but knowledge is not the same as wisdom. So I would say that wisdom is how we use knowledge. It's not quite the same thing. And I think sometimes we confuse the fact that somebody who knows lots of facts is a wise person. They may be knowledgeable, that doesn't make them wise. And again, I think increasingly we need to be discerning when communicating to wider audiences and when the news media are looking for experts and specialists, commentators on particular issues. The difference between just relating knowledge and then analysing that and imparting wisdom. We often confuse both of those things, and being clear about what is it that this person in front of me is sharing with me. Is it knowledge or is it wisdom? I think is very important. The other thing that I one of the big things in the area of work that I started doing research in was that, what can I share with you the research that I did? It was on funding formulae. The formulae that, how do governments distribute money to local public sector providers in housing, in education, in health. So they've got a big pot of money. How do they divide it out to all of the providers? And of course, governments come up with very complex formulas in thinking about how to assess need and how they can distribute that. That was a very slightly boring, well, okay, let's put it, a very boring area of research, but very important and often very complex, too complex for most people to sort of spend time sort of thinking about or trying to understand. And so lots of my work as an academic was trying to simplify the complexity of the real world into a simpler model that other people could grasp and understand. That's a good thing, I think, as long as you understand that we have simplified complexity for a reason of understanding and trying to communicate it. Where, again, I think the line becomes blurred is when we try to come up with simplistic answers to complex problems. So I think it is good to try to simplify complexity so people can understand it and engage with it. I think it's dangerous when we try to present a simplistic argument or solution to something that is very complex. Again, the difference between those two things, I found very early in my career, people got confused between those two things. So particularly politicians, and I sort of live in that world of politics, but I think also this is common ground with sometimes journalists, is that, yeah, all that's very good, but tell me what I need to do. Or tell me what the problem is in one sentence. And it's very good to try to, sometimes it is a mark of deep understanding and knowledge and even wisdom to be able to synthesize something very simply and neatly and concisely. But sometimes people do it as a shortcut. And again, being wise to understand what is somebody saying. Are they just being simplistic in their understanding or in their belief about what the solution is? Or are they actually being helpful in simplifying it so that I can understand something better? So those are just some lessons from my first part. I will go quite quickly through most. I'm not going to dwell a long time on all seven of my jobs. I'm going to skip over some very briefly. But the next one, I guess, is going to be where I'm going to spend most of my time, which is in politics. And my reflections of being in frontline politics and supporting politicians behind the scenes. And here again, I start with my own personal story on this. In 2005, I was the Labour Party, sort of social democratic sort of party in the UK, the Labour Party candidate for Carmarthen East and Dynevor. That is an area where I grew up in southwest Wales. Part old industrial valley of coal mining and steel, but largely rural and agricultural, very high proportion of Welsh speakers. And I was a Labour Party candidate. It had been a Labour Party seat during the late 1980s and early 1990s, but it had been lost to the Welsh Nationalist Party in the election before I was running in 2000. And that had been quite a contentious election. And it was seen that although there was a decent-sized majority for the Welsh Nationalist sitting MP, that Labour might have a chance winning it back. Now, I won't go into this. It's a whole different talk about how God was incredibly gracious, but the providence of God in directing me to run and making very windy, bumpy roads smooth and straight and flat and even downhill, so pushing me through the door of being a candidate. That's a long story for another time, but it was a very hard-fought campaign. That's a very nice British way of saying it was a brutal campaign, and I've still got scars on my back and on my heart. We thought in the early days of the campaign we were doing very well. And then my opponent, who was a pretty ruthless campaigner, well, I would say ruthless. If you were sort of his supporter, you'd probably say very effective campaigner. He sort of got really the shackles came off and the gloves came off in sort of the fight. So there were a number of accusations against me. It may seem the most trivial, but it was very important to the constituency that I was portrayed as the Blairite Londoner who was dropped in to the local constituency instead of being the local person where my parents lived. The second sort of line of attack was that because I was a Tony Blair pick, which was not true at all, by the way, which is why I've got Gordon Brown there, who's a bit more left-wing than Tony Blair. I was pro-Iraq war, and that was very controversial at the time. So it was portrayed I was pro-war, and sort of had bought that. I'd never made any comment actually on the war at the time. I was just a candidate. I didn't have any power of that. Then thirdly, and probably most personally, it sort of the card was played that I was an evangelical Christian. My opponent is gay. When he first won the seat, he was not publicly sort of declared as being gay. During the election campaign, there was a big set-piece interview on television where he came out and said, I'm gay. I feel I have to do this because the Labour Party candidate is running a homophobic campaign against me. He's an evangelical Christian. The reason why I've got two leaflets up there is that he said he was going to make an official complaint. He never did. We were sort of for a number of days afterwards saying, well, what's the evidence? Why are you saying this about us? What came out, at least what I was told afterwards, was one of the pieces of evidence that he had against me, in terms of evidence of me running a homophobic campaign, was the leaflet on the left-hand side. By publishing a photo of myself and my wife, I was flaunting my heterosexuality to accentuate the fact that he was gay. So I say that because you can see on one hand, it's maybe clear the fact I'm standing here working for an organisation called CARE that I was not elected and I did not win that election. My opponent had a high profile because he was one of the key spokespeople against Tony Blair and the Iraq War in Parliament. It was also a high profile seat because he was a Welsh nationalist. It was the seat where the first Welsh nationalist MP had ever been elected. They'd lost the seat and he was the one that had won it back. That first Welsh nationalist MP had died during the campaign, so it was very high profile. So there was lots of coverage locally and even nationally to some extent for the seat. And some of the lessons coming out of that was that the media at the time, my feeling was, well, the news media in particular have got a predetermined narrative and they just want stories that fit into that narrative. So in some ways, what happens is that I went into the campaign thinking I'm going to be President Bartlett, at least in terms of the noble objectives that I would have in running the campaign. That we would run a clean campaign, it would be on the issues, it would be on the facts, it would be on hope, looking forward, what I thought I could do for the constituency. It would be a good campaign. Now, I think that to the best of my extent, that was the case. We did not get down in the bear pit or the mud and fight dirty with the candidate. It was very tempting to do that. because you can imagine people coming up to me with the rumours about his lifestyle and say, why don't you run these stories? You'll get coverage for them. No, we stuck to our guns. Even to the extent that Sundays, my team thought that was a great day to go campaigning because everybody would be at home. We should be door knocking on a Sundays. I said, no, guys, actually, I'm going to church on Sundays. So I would do a campaign meeting in the Sunday morning, then go to church, and the team had the day off. So I was going in there with thinking, politics is the West Wing. And the reality is I found out politics may be more like the House of Cards. Now, I think it's just as an interesting side note about culture, I look back at reruns of the West Wing now, and I think, wow, that's of its time. It's lovely, but it's a bit naive, a bit idealistic. It's very early 2000s. And the more recent series is the House of Cards. And even in the space of a couple of decades, how much more cynical have we become? In the UK, we've always had a degree of cynicism about our politicians, and I suspect it's the same in lots of your countries as well. But how much more cynical have we become about politicians? I shared this, I'm helping lead the Politics and Society Network, and I was telling the group yesterday, my wife and I, she likes American sitcoms, I like sports. Our common ground for watching TV is US crime dramas and Agatha Christie whodunits. And the reality is, you know that if there's a politician that appears in the first third of the program, they're either going to be corrupt or they're going to be the murderer. That's how culture looks at politicians. When I was running for Parliament, it was constantly said, oh, he's Tony Blair's pick. I'd actually never met Tony Blair at the time, so how I could be his pick, I don't quite know. But that was the portrayal. Oh, he's a baby Blair, sort of been dropped into West Wales. He's this posh person from England with these sort of, for a traditionally socialist, well, left of centre, let me be more careful in my language, given the sort of the international context, the left of centre nature of the constituency, being said that he's really a right-wing person in disguise. He's like a Tony Blair sort of clone. That was really negative. Also, what was really interesting was that was the election when there was a very, very famous quote in the United Kingdom came out where Tony Blair had a very famous spin doctor called Alistair Campbell. And Tony Blair was going to do an interview, and the BBC interviewer was going to ask Tony Blair about praying with George W. Bush. And Alistair Campbell said, we don't do God. We don't do God. And what was interesting was that percolated down, even though that quote was slightly taken out of context, what happened was, in terms of the party and the party support that I had, they became very, very nervous of my faith. So all the messaging was, stick to the talking points, don't get anywhere near faith. And yet my opponent was talking about faith and caricaturing my faith. More recently, and I'll come on to this in a bit later in my current role, the reality of me leading an evangelical Christian organisation in the UK now is that when I say that, people think of Donald Trump. And although we may have a wide, diverse variety of political viewpoints here from our American friends who are serving us so well and generously, who may be supporters, in Europe and in the UK, Donald Trump is a death sentence politically in most areas. Because there's an assumption around the sort of the style, the content, the key issues, the objectives, the whole means of operating that are wholly negative. There's a stereotype that is just imposed on us. All of these things, I think, are the context of what I flippantly have called the game of politics. And of course, being involved in politics, I believe passionately that politics is one of the best ways in which we can change life for large numbers of people for the better. It is a potential force and power for good. But equally, people often see politics as a game. And part of that, I think, is that there is this idea that there's you've got your talking points as a politician, the media have got their agenda of getting a headline, and it's a competition, it's a game between the two of you. Sort of who's going to win out? Are you going to get your talking points across, or are they going to get you to say something ridiculous, outlandish, that they can blaze as a headline? And the sense that the game, actually on both sides, it's easy for the politicians to say, this is what the media want, but equally the media say, well, this is what the politicians want. I think both sides actually have a joint shared interest in criticism, in conflict, and in personality. The rules of the game, if you're a politician at least, are stay on message, don't be controversial, always talk about the voters. So rarely, actually, nowadays, I think you get a politician, and it's a brave politician who will come up and say, my vision is ... Far more likely you will get a politician saying something along the lines of, well, the voters in my constituency believe ... It's an impoverished debate as a result, isn't it? And there's mutuality on both sides. Actually, both sides need one another. And the reality is that the other side, one side likes to portray the other side as parasitic. But reality is that it is mutuality, that they both need one another. Just two very quick examples, one biblical, because of time I'll do one. Daniel chapter 1. I think is a fascinating, I always go back to Daniel chapter 1 because we're drawn in Daniel, aren't we, in terms of our memory and our thinking to Daniel of the lion's den or Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace. And I think Daniel 1 is an incredibly important chapter because we see there Daniel as a young man beginning the life of spiritual discipline and spiritual formation that enabled him to be the Daniel of the lion den and the fiery furnace later in life. And when you see him, so he's taken into exile, so he goes along with that. I know it does not seem like much of a choice to us, but he could have resisted and simply either got killed or left behind. But he was taken into captivity, into exile. He gets placed into the civil service college of the empire to be indoctrinated in not just how the bureaucracy would run, but also the culture. His name was changed, so in some ways his identity was sort of being changed. And yet his drawing of the line seemed to be over food and not even over kosher rules. So it seems sort of weird. Without going into sort of the reasons why I think that was the case, it was important that he drew the line somewhere to sort of define his identity as a man of God. Somebody who saw Yahweh as his Lord and Master, not the Emperor of the Kingdom. But the way he did it, if you look at Daniel chapter 1, he's incredibly wise in his tactics. He doesn't just go up to his civil service manager or training tutor and say, not doing that, not Christian, I'm an Israelite, I'm not doing it. That's not what he does, is it? He actually goes up and basically says, I understand what you have to do and how you are held accountable, but I feel really strongly about this. How can we sort of find some common ground where I can sort of stick to my identity and my dietary requirements, but I know that you're going to be held account for my well-being and my performance. So if that slips in any way, we'll reassess, we'll reevaluate. It's really intelligent how we sort of don't sort of have to necessarily. Spurgeon, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, there's a saying, is there, say, what's the lesser of two evils? Is that saying in English? Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, well, when you're faced with two evils, do neither. Be creative and find a different way. So I think that often we think of politics and the news media as a zero-sum game. It's a game, who's going to win? There's always there may be sort of 80% win for the media, 20% for the politics. It may not be all or other, but there's a balance and there's a sort of, one side will come out better than the other. There are ways, I would suggest, that we can remain faithful and seek ways in which we understand the needs and objectives of people working in the news media or the objectives of the politician. I'm going to give you real life case studies that isn't me. 2 examples of Christians in politics in the UK, and 2 very different approaches and 2 very different outcomes. And I think I can sort of use, but I know both of these individuals, and so I don't think they would mind me portraying them as I'm going to portray them. I think it is reasonably fair that they would recognise my portrayal of them. The person nearest to me, on the right-hand side, as you see, is somebody called Tim Farron. He led the Liberal Democrats Party. The Liberal Democrats at the time were the 3rd largest party in the UK. They're the 3rd UK-wide party in the UK. He became leader in 2015. He was known as a Christian. He was known to have evangelical views. Had some interviews when he became leader around that topic. But in 2017, when there was a general election, there was an interview where he was asked about his Christian views. And then in Parliament, a gay MP sort of stood up and said, do you, Tim Farron, or does the right honourable member for ... do you think being gay is a sin? And he said no. And then that was followed up with lots of interviews that sort of kept on asking him, not just whether he thought somebody being gay was a sin, but did he think gay sex was a sin? Now, for a long period, he sort of refused to answer. Then finally, with the pressure, he sort of said he didn't think gay sex was a sin. And then after the election, he said, oh, that was a mistake. I was wrong. And actually, I do think it's wrong. And I made a mistake there. All of that was hugely controversial at the time, was in the news most days, and it led to Tim Farron having to resign as the party leader after the election. But it was clear that he wasn't going to be party leader before the election because of all the controversy. Kate Forbes is somebody who has stood as the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party this year. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister in Scotland, leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, stood down, sort of slightly surprised everybody about timing, said she was going to stand down with immediate effect, a leadership campaign. It came out quite early on that there was one establishment preferred figure, the person who is now actually the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf. He was clearly being backed by the party bureaucracy and hierarchy, had all the resources behind him. Kate was the finance minister, but had been on maternity leave and was a very well-known evangelical Christian, very open about her evangelical Christian faith and the church that she went to and so on. Very early in the campaign, she was asked about her views around sexuality, but also there was a very controversial bill in the Scottish Parliament, the Gender Recognition Bill, which was changing the ability of people to, they didn't have to wait as long for endorsement to change their gender, so they could self-declare much more easily what their gender, official gender was. And she was asked about whether she was on maternity leave when the vote had happened. Would you have voted for it if you were not on maternity leave? And she said, no, I wouldn't have voted for it because of my Christian faith. Within minutes, that was hitting the social media. Social media was ablaze with controversy. All the main media outlets said within hours, her campaign is over. She's finished, she's dead in the water, she's going to have to pull out. Lots of leading SNP members and in the Parliament withdrew their support for her. But she said, well, I've been open about this all along. It's not a surprise for anybody. I have not hidden my beliefs and what I think about things and how my faith impacts my voting. This is just me. I've always been open and honest about this. And there are other things that I want to talk about. She saw that media storm through the sort of 48, 72 hours and came out the other side and was clearly seen by the most people as the most competent candidate of the three people standing. In the end, the weight of the establishment against her meant she lost, but she got 48% of the membership vote in the election. So from somebody who's been written off and said, people won't accept your views, the fact that she was open, honest, and had integrity about her views, but also that she said, I'm not defined by a single issue, that I'm being open about what I believe on that, but my track record of experience, my competency, and my views on lots of other things are equally relevant. I'm a whole person, not a single issue person. I'm just going to draw some reflections from that, and I'm going to go through my the other points and other acts of your handout very, very quickly. I think that from my personal experience, but certainly sort of afterwards working, it's just actually understanding that both sides in this conversation have their own objectives. And there may be some common ground, and I think it's good to try to seek the common ground wherever possible. Sometimes there's not much common ground, but seek it and look for it, but equally respect that the journalist or the media person or the comms person, if you're the politician, has their goals and objectives and requirements that they have to meet, and think about how you're sensitive and empathetic to those. That's what I would say as a politician. I think it's equally the case the other way around, in terms of understand that the politician is a real person. They're not a candidate, or they're not even sort of a government officer. They're a person behind that, often more complex than we take time to understand. And therefore, both sides are broken image bearers. One of the most powerful things for me to remember in interacting with anybody is that the person that I'm interacting with is made in the image of God. He is dearly loved. Jesus died for him as much as he died for me, but he's also sinful and broken. She also needs Jesus. She also needs grace. So whoever's the other side that you're speaking to and engaging with, remember both the image bearing, but also the brokenness. And the fact that also, I talked about mutuality in the rules of the game. That only gets you so far. Understanding that there's a mutual dependence, that you need the oxygen of the media as a politician, and the media need content, will only get you so far in terms of a shared agenda and that common ground. I think that the issue of Kate Forbes means that we can have hope that we can redefine the rules. We don't have to be bound by what we perceive the rules of the game to be. If we believe God is sovereign and we believe in God's providence, we have the assurance, we have the security, we have the ability to be creative in trying to redefine the rules of the game. I would say that you as an audience, you should be far more creative than the political group that's a couple of doors away from you. That's your bread and butter, that's your business in some areas. And also to remember, I think for politicians, it's increasingly easy, made more easy to believe that the important voices are the loudest and that they represent a majority or large constituency when they may be just a very small minority speaking very loudly. There's C.S. Lewis wrote a book whose name I just can't recall now. It's not The Great Divorce. Anyway, but he wrote about the world actually in which we now find ourselves living, where there's this perception of a democratization of voices. Well, actually, the reality is in that democratization, what happens is the powerful rise to the top and get heard and suppress the voice of the minorities and the weak and the vulnerable. And we're lured and duped almost into believing that there's an equality in the public square of social media, when the reality is it's a very unequal channel. And I think the politicians increasingly forget that what they hear as the loudest voice is not the majority, or and they sort of think that that is the sort of the truth that they have to listen to. Okay, we're going to go quickly through the next two acts. I went on after being a candidate. I worked at the time for a trade union. It would have been very comfortable to stay there for the rest of my career. As you can imagine, trade unions have quite good terms and conditions. And sort of not a bad lifestyle in many ways. But I moved on to work for an NGO, a children's NGO, and then I worked for somebody called the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England. Now that is basically the children's ombudsman in England, an organisation that is set up by the government to protect the human rights of children and young people under 18, and with an explicit legal requirement and power to promote the rights of children and to protect sort of the rights of the vulnerable in particular. And quite strong powers to sort of investigate and to inquire and to sort of get people to give evidence, to sort of open doors, etc., that sort of are barred to most people. A really powerful, influential role. It was sort of in government but outside the government at the same time. What was striking there was when you work in that kind of role, how difficult it is to get your stories into the media. So what I learnt in that period, working for charities, sort of children's NGOs, charities, and the Children's Commissioner, is the immense power that the media has, but how difficult it is to tap into that power, and how much more difficult it is then to sort of almost control the power that the media has. That sounds very sort of Machiavellian or even Nietzschean in terms of controlling power, etc. What I mean by that is that I'll give you an example of some projects I worked on for the Children's Commissioner. We worked on a project that was investigating the fact that young women in the care system and other vulnerable women, young women, so teenagers, were being picked up by men and drawn into gangs of men who would sexually exploit them. And this was horrific, evil, dark sort of area of work to investigate and to explore. And it's happening across most communities of the UK. I would say that there's not a large town in the UK that there's not some of this going on. And it's been exposed partly through the work of the Children's Commission, now taken up by others. But we looked into it, we investigated, we exposed it, we shone a light on it. That was incredibly good work. It took a long time for the media to become interested. When they became interested, they were very interested because it was a big story of exposing sort of evil and harm. But what it quickly turned into was a story about groups of Asian men exploiting young white women. Now, there's a truth that was happening. There were gangs of Muslim men picking up and grooming young white women in care and taking them into their gangs and exploiting them. But it wasn't the only story. There were gangs of white men exploiting women of all ethnicities, young women of all ethnicities. So it wasn't, but it was a very nice, neat story. It was the complex, not just being made simple, but a simplistic message about what the problem was. So that was the sort of one. The other one I would sort of say is we looked into examining the impact of drink on young people. Not, as you may imagine, and would be easy to say, isn't it awful how much young people are drinking? Actually, the evidence is young people are drinking less and less alcohol. But the story was the impact of parents drinking on their upbringing of children. Because in lots of scandals around child neglect and child abuse, there's nearly always sort of a toxic trio, we call it, of domestic violence, mental health, and some sort of addiction, often drink, if not drugs. So we wanted to look into the impact of drinking on children's upbringing. We sort of took the evidence out saying this is a really big issue. Within the first 2 or 3 interviews of presenting the work, one journalist said, tell us how much you think drinking too much is per week. So we said, well, the National Health Service and the Public Health sort of office say that it's this many units a week. You can see the penny dropping in the journalist thinking, most middle-class parents drink that much every week. So suddenly it wasn't a story about these awful drunk parents on a social housing estate, on benefits, neglecting and abusing their children. It suddenly became, the Office of the Children's Commissioner says that all these great, brilliant, amazing parents are drinking too much and sort of ruining their children's future. So you can shine a light, but be careful, if you're from my perspective, on how the media may pick it up and take it on in ways that you can't imagine. So again, power to do good is amazing. the challenge is like, how do you keep the spotlight on the right thing if you are presenting from my perspective? The power of stories. Time and time again, a journalist has said to me, that's a really important issue, bring me a story. I said, well, I'm bringing you a story, I've got the evidence. No, bring me a real life person who shows that to be the case. Increasingly, I think that we only get you can use the power of the media when we can harness the experience of individuals and demonstrate the point we're trying to make through the lived experience of somebody. Penultimate act now, before we sort of come on to the last one, is me looking forward. But my current job is working for a Christian organisation called CARE. CARE came out of a church movement in the early 1970s, which was a response to the progressive legislation, social legislation in the UK of the late 60s and early 70s. The church sort of woke up and thought, hang on, all of these things have changed, and we didn't know that they were going on, from legislation around sexuality, the beginning of life, pornography, gambling, a whole raft of things. CARE was created 40 years ago this year as a sort of organisation to come out of that movement. And for 40 years, we've been working in Parliament with politicians to try to reflect biblical teaching into the political debates of the day. Now, I've been Chief Executive of CARE for a year and a half. The very clear, sort of striking thing for me is that however careful we are in presenting our case on culturally unpopular issues, we'll be stereotyped. However much we work on issues that stand outside of those that the stereotype says that, well, Christians aren't interested in that, they're just interested in these issues, it's very, very difficult to get any coverage and stories about us because of the power of stereotypes. So we are almost defined by some groups as being pro-life, anti-LGBT rights, anti-women, anti-freedom when it comes to things like pornography and gambling, sort of freedom to do those things. The reality is we do work on human trafficking. CARE, one of our distinctive skills is that we've got in-house capacity to write legislation, write laws, and write amendments to laws. So we can draft that. We don't just give briefings to people. We sort of write the laws and we say, look, this is what you can do in law. This is an amendment you can make to this law to make it better. And we've had a huge amount of success in the area of anti-trafficking. So Northern Ireland has got a really strong piece of legislation around anti-trafficking that was written by us, given to a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. He sponsored it and took it on, and it got passed into law. We're doing right now amendments to immigration bill in the UK, to online safety bill in the UK to sort of protect children from online pornography and harm. We're writing sort of amendments and briefing on gambling laws in the UK. All these things are incredibly important, integral to our Christian view of the dignity of the human being, of every person having equal worth and equal dignity in God's sight. And yet, it's really, really difficult to get any coverage that is positive outside of the abortion debate and maybe to a lesser extent assisted suicide and gay marriage. And yet we're not defined by those things. Clearly we have a position and we've worked on those things, but equally the caricature is a caricature of us. Why I'm saying that is because we have had some success, but it's interesting that where we've had success on things like trafficking and gambling and pornography, getting coverage in the news media, it's been CARE, the social policy charity, not CARE, Christian Action, Research and Education, which is, CARE is an acronym for that. That's our full title. And interestingly, there's been times when there's been pieces that are in my name, but we got into the press, and non-Christians have retweeted, say, this is a great article, this is a really important point. And then somebody down the line, sort of the Twitter feed will say, do you know who these people are? It's like, well, the point is the point. It's like, if we've got a good point and we're expert in it, accept it. I'm going to quickly go through the lessons because I'm conscious of time. I think it's really difficult sometimes for Christians to prove their credibility. I was having breakfast mentoring somebody from the Politics Network this morning who works in academia, but is a frequent commentator on the media. And she said, they like me because I'm a university academic, as an expert. If I said I was a Christian, even though my qualifications wouldn't change, my credibility would go down. The reality, the power of stereotypes. It's really easy for us to be aligned with groups or with topics or even tactics that are not really representing what we do and who we are. And then understanding the difference between the old media and the new media. We have been attacked several times in the last year by news websites, or a news website in particular. The reality is their standards are far lower than the old news media. But weirdly and ironically, what happens is their standards of journalism, I would argue, are far lower, but they report something that is very debatable at best. But then the old print media will read it and say, oh, well, it's online, we can print it. And so the story gets picked up. It's this weird sort of symbiotic relationship between old and new media. And there's a woman called Amanda Ripley, who's not a Christian, but she's written a book on high conflict, called A High Conflict. And it's about how current culture, we are becoming heightened in our conflict. You know, we're becoming more adversarial with one another. And she sort of talks about the stages of how conflict builds, up to the point where there's violence sometimes as well. And she talks about in the early stages there being, be aware and look out for conflict entrepreneurs or for fire starters. There are people in whose interest it is to create conflict and to perpetuate the stereotypes that are not the reality. So let's just be aware of those. I'm going to finish, before getting you into groups, on, I want to end on a hopeful note, that I do believe that whilst we are looking forward to new creation and all things being redeemed and restored under Christ's headship, that we are still called in the here and now to do redemptive acts. And so how can we think about our role as Christians, redeeming, not fully, but trying to point to that full redemption, but how can we do redemptive acts in our spheres of influence? And I'm just going to go through these because they're pretty self-explanatory. I think, first of all, always remember, and it seems a ridiculously simple point to make, but I think we forget it, understand who your true master is that you're serving. You can't serve two masters. There may be delegated authority. God may have ordained the authorities that are in place. They're under his sovereignty. But your ultimate boss and your accountability is to the Lord. Understand your cultural mandate. It is really easy to sort of fall into our sinful nature and just be critics and just condemn. Our cultural mandate in the beginning of Genesis is to be culture makers. How are you making culture in a positive way as sort of God intended? Understand the power of the tongue, language, stereotypes and stories. We've covered a bit of that. The Proverbs through to James talks about the power of the tongue. In your context, that may be the power of your fingertips more than your tongue. Beware conflict entrepreneurs. Who are they? Are they you? That's the more scary thing. Beware the temptation that the ends justify the means. So often, Christians in the public square, whatever their role, I've heard the justification, well, there's a greater good we're working towards. Never believe that the greater good end or outcome that you're seeking justifies being un-Christ-like in the means of getting there. God is ultimately in control of the ends and the outcome. You are in control with the power of the Holy Spirit of how you get there and the journey. And your witness is incredibly important. Beware that the domination, not democratization of ideas within the new public square. So that idea that's a sense that we think that there's a democratization with social media. Actually, it's not. There are powerful voices. And I think the sooner people begin to realize that actually we've just moved in from one elite, if you want to use that language, to a different elite in the sort of the new social media channels that we have. And then I was finally going to say the blessing and responsibility of the image bearing. I had to come up with the 7th point because that's a holy number. I couldn't stick it at 6. But it is a blessing and a responsibility to be an image bearer, isn't it? The fact that we are called to be culture makers. We are called to reflect our Creator and our Saviour in the public square. When people look at us, they should see a mirror or a dim reflection of our Saviour. But that's a big responsibility as well, isn't it? To think about how we do that.